Brittany, that we have a co-sponsor, and that co-sponsor is on the next slide. It's Org Community. Org Community it's a Chicago-based organization, and it brings together executives and industry partners into online discussions and forums. They've got programs going on, and we're really happy to be a part of Org Community. And just keep in mind, if you join Org Community, it's a one-stop shop for your CAE requirements, your Certified Association Executive Program requirements. So take a look at Org Community. Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Or before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about January's webinar. We skipped December for a lot of reasons. We're going to pick up our webinar series in January with a really exciting speaker, Tammy Bonadny. She is an expert on building content, particularly in the academic medical space. As many of you know, we have a lot of clients that are involved in the medical community and healthcare, and building CME digital content and having a strategy around it is really, really important. So I expect that to be a well-attended webinar in January 30th at 11:30 a.m. But today we are going to hear from Mike Ristisi, president of Watershed Learning Record Store, Watershed LRS. It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Ristisi, who was very involved in the e-learning standard called SCORM, and has now moved on into the xAPI next generation data gathering and imaging or displaying. So Mike, take it from here. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, John and Brittany. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about what is happening in the learning space right now and the opportunities that I think are sitting right in front of us. And so it gets me really excited to have the opportunity to come and talk to different audiences about where we're going and what I think the big opportunities are for all of us in the learning space. And I hope you'll enjoy the conversation here, but feel free to throw some questions into the chat box over there. Brittany will be monitoring those and maybe throwing out some occasionally, and we'll definitely save some time at the end of the presentation for them. And one thing I like to do with all my webinars is if we don't get to all the questions during the webinar, we'll type up the answers and send those to you after the webinar. So feel free to put stuff in there. I really don't like talking to myself, so I'd be happy to take this in a different direction or make it into an interactive conversation as you want to. So again, my name is Mike Ristisi. I've been in this kind of corporate learning space since about 1999, started in the kind of software side of things, where I developed knowledge of this arcane technical learning standard called SCORM, which led me to the creation of my former company, which was called Rusty Software. We were at scorm.com or SCORM Cloud. If you ever came across any of those online tools, we're kind of all things SCORM to all people. And then in 2012, we were fortunate to partner with the Department of Defense to create the next version of that, originally called the Tin Can API, now called Experience API or xAPI. And that's what I want to talk to you about is what is xAPI and what are really the big shifts that are now suddenly possible because of that, and what's going to drive change in the learning space. But xAPI is a really, really kind of small technical thing. It's a really zoomed in thing. I want to start the presentation by kind of zooming way out and talking about things really from the 30,000 foot level. Then we're going to try to connect the two and see how a couple of these macro and micro trends are really coming together to create a really dynamic time in our space right now. So we start out with this notion from a guy named John Hagel, who I had the pleasure to meet with last year. John is kind of a Silicon Valley legend. He's works at a high-end Deloitte think tank right now. And John made an assertion when we spoke last May. He said, scalable learning is the new reason for large organizations to exist. And this quote kind of blew my mind. It changed my thinking a little bit. Let me unpack what he means there. John asserts that large organizations used to exist to create scalable efficiency, to help us do the same thing over and over again, bigger, faster, more efficiently, drive down prices, get economies of scale. Well, we live in a world that is characterized by exponential change, driven by technology and globalization and other things. In a world of exponential change, doing the same thing over and over again is a recipe for early obsolescence. It is the exact opposite of what you want to do. We are characterized by a world of near constant disruption, to which the only solution is near constant innovation. A culture of near constant innovation, of constant change, is often associated with you giving the advantage to the smaller, more nimble companies. And so in this 21st century, why do large organizations still have a place in the world? Why do they matter? And how can their size continue to be advantageous? John asserts that it's by enabling scalable learning. It's about harnessing all of the resources and all of the people to collectively understand the change and disruption that is happening, learn about it, and disseminate that knowledge broadly within the organization. Learning becomes the new strategic advantage for organizations in a world of exponential change. That really kind of got me really thinking and presents, I think, a massive, massive opportunity. Now, mind you, when John's talking about scalable learning, he's not just talking about send more people to an instructor-led training course or take more e-learning course or read more books. He's not talking about scaling up what we're doing. He's talking about the discovery, digestion, and distribution of new knowledge, discovering new knowledge through study, experimentation, practice, by taking advantage of all of the places where we can connect with other flows and other people, other thought leaders, digesting all of that knowledge and all of that shared experience into an organization to ensure that it's valid and that it has a positive impact, and then rapidly disseminating that new knowledge to the entire organization. That's what scalable learning looks like. That's what gives us a huge strategic advantage. But I'd like you to ask yourselves, are your current learning systems going to get you there? The answer typically is no, that's not what they were designed for. But fortunately, there's kind of a new generation of tools and technologies coming in. And another quote from John that I absolutely loved: in an exponential world, small moves smartly made can set big changes in motion. When the world around us is changing fast, getting just a little bit ahead starts to open up, a big lead for people who are the early movers, making small, smart moves to start to get there. So, how do we get there? What is the biggest enabler of scalable learning? What is the one small, smart move we can make right now to lay a foundation and set ourselves on that path to becoming a scalable learning organization? Becoming a scalable learning organization, really, truly embracing learning as a strategic initiative, that's a big, big, daunting task. It's a huge transformation, but we have to start somewhere. We have to start with what we can do now and take those first steps to start working in that direction, to modernize our thinking about learning and how we're going about enabling our learners. So my answer to that question is data. It's using analytics. It's using information. I love this quote from W. Edward Deming. He says, "Without data, you're just another person with an opinion." And I think that's often where we are in learning right now. We put a bunch of stuff out there, but by and large, we're not using data to connect the learning that we're providing with outcomes. We're not using data to demonstrate the improvement of our professionals. And that is a big missed opportunity, I think. I think the key to advancing the learning profession right now is to join the rest of the world and start to use data routinely and much more rigorously to start to measure and quantify the work that we're doing and whether or not it is in fact effective. And that's not an easy challenge, I know, but I think it's a really important one. I look at organizations, and we live in this increasingly knowledge-based economy, right? Where talent is our most precious asset. Well, how the heck do we let the group that's responsible for improving the value of our most important asset, of improving the performance of our people, how do we let that group get by without any kind of data-driven accountability, without demonstrating effectiveness and linking that to actual outcomes and improvements in capabilities and performance? The answer historically has been that it's too hard. And it's been too hard to get at that data. I mean, sometimes we get the data, we don't really know what to do with that data, but that's a bit of a chicken and egg situation I'll talk about in a minute. But I really do believe that there's a really massive opportunity here, not just for us as learning professionals, but really to make a little difference in the world. Yeah, I sit back and say, okay, right now, I think we can all agree that there's a lot of room for improvement in learning. And if we could say, if say the introduction of a data-driven mentality that leads to rigorous, continuous improvement to improve our outcomes, do we think that could improve the productivity? Could that improve the effectiveness of learning by 10%? I think that is totally possible. I think 10% is probably a low number for the amount of improvement in the effectiveness of the learning programs at a macro scale that we could make happen here. But if we can improve the way we develop our workforce by 10%, could that maybe lead to a 1% productivity improvement for our workforce? I think that's reasonable. I think that's a reasonable goal. But a 1% productivity improvement applied, L&D touches everybody, touches an entire workforce. If we can improve our entire workforce by 1%, that's a huge productivity improvement for the world, for our country. And that is a big deal. And I think that is kind of the journey that we're starting on right now. So it's learning's turn. I think it's learning's turn to step up. I think it's learning's turn to think strategically and develop that culture of continuous improvement. But to get there, it requires a change of attitude and a change of strategy. We need to think in the same terms that our business thinks in and make sure we align our strategy to the outcomes and the strategy of the business. Often employee performance, but also oftentimes, just more improvement of professionals that are out there and skills and capabilities and increasing career advancements and placements, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different ways we can think about, aligning learning programs to outcomes. So learning, I think, is on the same path that marketing has been on for the last 20 years. If you look back at where marketing was 20 years ago, it was very much, mass marketing. The marketing department was run by a creative. You heard the phrase, it was Don Draper, Mad Men type era. You heard the phrase spray and pray. You heard the phrase, I know half my marketing's working, I just don't know which half. It was simply just throwing a bunch of stuff out there and hoping that it worked. Well, that's not where marketing is anymore. Right now, marketing is, it's an interactive conversation. You hear it's run by analytical people. You hear, A/B testing and segmentation and targeting and personalization within marketing. And that's completely changed marketing's position within the organization. It's completely changed that profession over a relatively short period of time. Now marketing is often super strategic within organizations. Marketing isn't run by the creatives anymore. It's run by the data people. And marketing used to be kind of the thing that was tolerated because you knew you needed it, but the first thing that got cut in a downturn. And now it's not anymore. When you can go to your CEO and say, I spent $1 on marketing and turned to $1.50 on sales, you get all the budget you ever wanted. It sounds a lot like where learning is and where I think learning can go. Right now, I say we're in this mass marketing period of where marketing was, but I think we can get to where they are now. So let's look at how did they get there. The things that started with the marketing transition was an explosion of new tools that came out in the space. The first amongst them was probably Google AdWords, tools that allowed you to do marketing in different ways than you could before. And then all those tools started to produce data. You could get access to what was happening within there. And then you started to see tools like HubSpot and Marketo, these marketing automation tools that emerged to allow you to consume all of the data, use it to then optimize your programs, see what was working and cut that out, or see what's working and do more with that, see what's not working and cut that out. And then after those tools were there and the knowledge about how to use those tools emerged in the industry, that's when the whole industry started to shift. And I think that same thing is happening in learning right now. We'll talk about xAPI on the next slide over here, but xAPI is catalyzing the creation of a lot more new tools coming into the space. I've been going to learning trade shows for far too long now, and just in the last couple of years has the trade show floor started to look different. It's no longer just e-learning courses and LMSs. You've got a lot more gamification and mobile, and the new learning experience platforms are really taking off. Lots of new tools coming out. xAPI is what unlocks our ability to capture data from all of those tools. And my company and others like them are providing the analytics tools that allow you to capture all that data and change. And we hope that will change the way the learning profession looks at data. When they can easily access it and use it, we're hoping that will drive a shift in the conversation towards being more data-driven, more performance-focused. And that, I think, is a really big, really exciting shift that is being catalyzed by a relatively obscure bit of technology called xAPI, which is what we'll talk about now. So we've got this big, huge kind of opportunity from us, and now we're going to shift down to let's talk about this one little thing that is going to enable a lot of these really big things. And so, excuse me, what is xAPI? xAPI is a standard. It is a way that software programs communicate with each other. And if that sounds as exciting as watching paint dry, you can kind of be actually right. But let me explain to you why you should care. Standards, I assert, define and confine an industry. If you want to sell something on the mass market, you can't customize it for every sale that you make. It needs to be something that just plugs and plays into the existing environment of your customers. I like to use the analogy of a USB cable. If you want to sell something on the mass market that plugs into a computer, it has to work with USB. That's the standard. Well, that cable has constraints. Whatever those constraints are, whether it's data transfer rate or power availability, whatever those constraints are, confine the products on the market. You can't sell something with USB that needs more power than USB provides. So the constraints of the standard confine all of the products that are in that marketplace. The standard defines and confines the industry. Well, in our space, kind of online learning, the only standard we've had is something called SCORM. And SCORM, I love it. It's, it was the whole focus of my last company. But it was created in the year 2000. It was brilliant for its time. But now that it's 2017, it's massively out of date. Think about this. We have an entire industry, an entire space that is defined and confined by a 17-year-old model. When you look at how hard it is to do a lot of things in our space, like mobile and social and all these big things that happened over the last 17 years, and scratch your head, why is it so easy for everybody else but so hard for us? It's because SCORM was created before these things were envisioned. And so if you want to do a mobile app in learning right now, there's no kind of standard way to just plug that into your LMS. And so as a new standard comes out, it presents this huge opportunity for innovation and disruption. My former company, Rusty Software, was involved in a research project with the U.S. government to start this process of creating this new standard between kind of 2010 and 2013. The earliest research was started in 2010, then kind of the 1.0 version of what's now Experience API came out in 2013. And you can kind of think of this as just a much more modern way of allowing learning systems to communicate. It's going to free us from the constraints of SCORM and allow us to to plug in mobile and social and games and all these kind of things that we couldn't incorporate into our learning ecosystem. So the first kind of big impact to think about with xAPI is the ability to use any type of tool you want to in your learning ecosystems. If you get one takeaway for what is xAPI, it is the ability to start with a blank sheet of paper and not think about, oh, it has to go in my LMS and be in SCORM e-learning course package, blah 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 blah, boring. xAPI really frees us to use a lot of even the consumer technologies that we have out there in our learning ecosystems and still have that ability to track and communicate data. And I'll show you an example from Visa a little bit later in this presentation about kind of how they're doing that in a more modern learning ecosystem. So, some other big impacts of xAPI. First of all, xAPI allows us to track all data, not just the tiny fraction of learning that happens in an e-learning course in an LMS. I like to ask people during these talks, what percentage of what you've learned in your lifetime has come from an e-learning course in an LMS or even an ILT? The answer is often that it's pretty small. Learning is an intrinsically human activity that happens in many, many, many different places. I don't care how good any one system or tool is, learning is always going to happen in a wide variety of places. xAPI allows us to track all of that data. And we can get into how, if you guys are interested. I'm going to try to keep this out of the geeky weeds. xAPI isn't some magical system that knows how to read brains and knows what people learns, but as a technology, it can be applied in a very unconstrained way to a lot of environments that want to participate in a learning ecosystem. It also tracks things potentially at a much more granular level. So, SCORM often allows us to track kind of what we call the big four. How much time did you spend in a course? Did you finish it? Did you pass it or fail it? What was your score? That was kind of the limit of the data you often got out of there. xAPI allows us, and also SCORM only allowed us to track an e-learning course delivered via an LMS to a known single user in a web browser while connected to the internet. It had all these very, very tight descriptions, limitations on what it could track. xAPI allows us to track a much broader set of things. I've already mentioned like games and simulations and all those kind of things, but I haven't mentioned both the fact that you can do things that happen in the real world, for instance, and you can also track very detailed data and very high-level data. xAPI is made up of a series of statements about learning experiences. A statement takes the form, I did this. And so you could say, Mike completed course, Mike passed course, Mike scored 85% on the course, all the way down to, Mike answered question 1 with answer B, which was incorrect and took, 48 seconds to answer that. All the way down to if you're, in a simulation, Mike, picture a flight simulator. Mike set the flaps to this setting and then adjusted the throttle to this setting and successfully landed the plane, type of deal. But then you can go all, you can get very, very low level detail all the way up to, Mike graduated Vanderbilt University and everything in between. It's a very, very flexible and rich set of data that can be tracked. All of this data can be tracked in real time, allowing this data to flow really seamlessly together, allowing us to create and distribute reports throughout our organization without delays, without having to, and the data flows seamlessly. We don't have to, monkey with 100 spreadsheets. One of the big problems with people trying to do learning analytics right now is it's just too hard. The data, when the data is available, it's available in 15 different formats. And I've talked to just some poor souls over the last couple of years who are really trying hard to do learning analytics, but it means that their job is for the first 7 days of the month to just copy and paste spreadsheets and create, VLOOKUPs and pivot tables, and then, copy and paste charts into PowerPoints to email out to, the rest of the organization. They're doing all that just to get some basic, compliance and completion data out of their LMS. When things are that hard, when there's that much friction, they don't really happen. When you remove friction, you make things suddenly possible. We talked about kind of that chicken egg situation I wanted to come back to, where we don't really know what to do with learning data. Oftentimes, the art of learning evaluation and learning analytics is still, I would argue, very new. I mean, the Kirkpatricks have been doing this stuff since 1954, but I think we can do a whole lot better than that. I think part of the reason for the immaturity is that it's just not done very often. I think once we remove that friction and allow people to start playing with these things, then that's when the ideas start to explode and be shared, and when the body of industry knowledge really starts to mature and take hold. So I think, I think the catalyst of extra data really propels the whole space forward, and eventually solves the problem of we don't even know how to evaluate learning oftentimes now as well. One of the really cool things about xAPI is that not only does it allow us to track learning data, it also in that same format allows us to include data about behaviors and actual performance, to allow us to bring all of that data together and assess its impact, assess whether we were able to demonstrably improve people and whether that improvement had an effect on outcomes of our stakeholders. That's where things get really interesting. I can get into some of the technical reasons why xAPI allows us to do that later on if you really care in the questions. But this is the other thing that xAPI does is kind of redefines the learning ecosystem. I talked about bringing in lots of other tools. That's all made possible by a new type of tool called a learning record store. Heads up, Watershed's a learning record store. This is what we're doing and selling. So I'll try not to be super biased here. This isn't a sales pitch. But a learning record store, you can think of the learning record store as the part of the LMS that tracks who does what. And then in Watershed's case, we provide a reporting and analytics layer on top of that. But by separating the tracking of who does what from the delivery of the learning experiences, we're able to kind of redefine what a learning ecosystem looks like. No longer do we have to shove everything into one monolithic LMS. We can use best-of-breed tools and bring them together as necessary to create the ideal learning ecosystem for our organization. Another thing that xAPI allows us to do, it's not up here, but it allows us to kind of create distributed portfolios of learners' information. It allows us to have learning records. xAPI is inherently open. The data that goes into a learning record store can also go out of a learning record store, and it can also be transferred seamlessly between learning record stores. And so we can take data from one organization's learning record store and move it to another organization's learning record store. We can host a personal portfolio of our learning records and share parts of that with other organizations that are out there. That kind of world of portable credentials is really another kind of big opportunity that is sitting out there that people are starting to work on now. The xAPI solves a lot of the technical challenges with that. A lot of the kind of business level challenges and the definition of what is a credential, what do these things mean, are still kind of works in progress right now that different communities of practice are starting to focus on using xAPI as their underlying communication protocol. So that's kind of the quick and dirty kind of what is xAPI and what are the big impacts that it's going to have. I want to talk a little bit about what I think is the biggest impact in the title of this presentation around learning analytics. What is learning analytics and what can we do now that we have all of this data? And oftentimes when we mention learning analytics, we get a lot of different people with a lot of different thoughts as to what that term means. And So we've just kind of put out a proposed kind of way of categorizing different types of learning analytics, so we can illustrate both the breadth of types of learning analytics that are possible and give you some thoughts as to what you could be starting to measure, and also the different levels of sophistication within there. So let's start with the complexity of learning analytics. When people talk about analytics, if a vendor tells you they have analytics, oftentimes they mean they have a bar chart somewhere. When a consumer is asking for analytics, oftentimes they're thinking about AI and machine learning and all the crazy stuff that Silicon Valley is doing. And both of those are valid definitions of analytics. So we throw out kind of 4 different stages of sophistication within learning analytics, and this is a journey that we need to take and move up synchronously along. We can't just all of a sudden go out one day and say, ooh, we're going to do AI. We need to build a big foundation before we can get to doing that really sophisticated stuff. And it all starts with the simple act of measurement. A simple act of tracking things and recording their values. Before we can do anything, we need to just start getting the data, making sure we have good data, collecting it, and building up a sufficient volume of that analytics becomes, that there's enough interesting information in there that becomes worth our time to start looking at it. And measurement, data collection can happen one of 2 ways. It can be passive or active, we like to say. Passive data collection usually occurs as a byproduct of, of some other system usage. You can think of it as kind of, the system is already being used in the background and we're just monitoring what's happening within that system. We can also actively seek to collect data. For instance, we could go use a performance observation checklist to go observe real world events and see what was going, very intentionally go choose to do that. Both of those are very valid strategies. Once you have the data, the next level of sophistication is evaluation, trying to make some meaning from the data that you've measured. Does that equate to something good or something bad? In more sophisticated statistical circles, this would be called descriptive analytics. What we're describing is what happened. Descriptive analytics say, here is the data, here are the things, the events that are happened. This is often characterized by kind of, high school level math, averages, means, modes, sums, all things I'm sure all of us on the webinar could easily understand and comprehend and probably put together ourselves over here. This is where you get into a lot of, just standard charts and graphs and those kind of things. And there's 2 more levels up here, but I want to impress upon you that 90% of the analytics happening in learning right now is just simple evaluation. And that's okay. There are really big gains to be had by starting to do simple evaluation, by simply starting to look at your data, understand your data, see the trends in your data, see what's changing, look for outliers and investigate what those will tell you. Lots and lots of good stuff happens just by getting to a good evaluation protocol that is routinely and regularly used within your organization. But once we've kind of got that down and want to get a little bit fancier, then we can kind of move into what we call advanced evaluation. When you get some larger data sets, you can start to apply some data mining and other more sophisticated techniques in there. And this is where you start to look at not just what happened, but why it happened. What was the driver of this result, and how can we infer statistically that this thing caused that thing? And this is where you get into more, college level statistics math. We're looking at, correlations and regression analysis and things like that a lot of us may have heard of, but probably aren't all that comfortable going out and trying to do on our own. And you really need a, computer system to really do it well for you and everything. But that gets to be pretty powerful to go in and say, hey, I see this improvement in performance, and I can demonstrate that this percentage of that was caused by this learning activity. That's really, really good stuff. Or we can say that there's a correlation between the people who participate in these and improved performance. That's where you really get to start to show interesting results and do interesting things. Beyond advanced evaluation, you can get into predictive and prescriptive type analytics, and this is where you're getting some of the Silicon Valley stuff. This is where you say, I saw what happened and I saw why it happened. So given the set of circumstances that I observe now, predictive analytics says, here is what I expect to happen next. It predicts the thing that is going to happen next. Prescriptive analytics takes that a step farther and says, based on what I think is going to happen next, here is what I think we should do to optimize the outcome. That's really sophisticated stuff. That requires a really big, really good data set that, quite honestly, is very rare in learning space right now. The holy grail of learning analytics would be a recommendation engine based on predictive and prescriptive analytics right now. To get there, though, we need a huge pile of data about learning events, coupled with the outcomes that are associated with those. Right now, there people will claim they have recommendation engines, but they're not predictive or prescriptive analytics recommendation engines. They're really, oh, other people like you were interested in this. I think it's going to be a little while still before we really get into having enough data to do those things in a very solid way. But I'm excited to see that there are people on that journey. So here's kind of the set. Right now, shoot to start measuring and evaluating. Know that you can see that vision of predictive and prescriptive stuff in the future. After you start up getting some good evaluation, you can do some advanced evaluation. But don't be intimidated by all that sophisticated stuff that's out there. Again, so much value to just getting started and working on evaluation we can all understand. So the next way to characterize learning analytics is to look at the different categories, the different types of learning analytics that are possible. And this is one where we see most people kind of talking past each other around the term. So we decided to break learning analytics out into 3 different categories. The first category we do call learning experience analytics. This is where we want to understand more about the activities we are delivering, about our e-learning courses, about our ILT, about our videos, et cetera, et cetera. How are they being used? What's being used? What's not being used? How much time are people spending in them? What are people searching for? What are people finding? What are people not finding when they search? Here we're really looking to kind of maximize the effectiveness and optimize our spend on our learning activities, looking to find problems. What are people not using, and are people always failing this? You do question type analysis in this category, those kind of things. With learning experience analytics, we want to understand more about the actual learning experiences, the activities that we're delivering. The next category is what we call learner analytics. And this is where we want to understand the people, or the person or the group of people that are participating in our learning activities. And here we'll get into competencies and skills and skill gaps, and we'll get into kind of readiness and compliance type things, going in and understand what do our people know and what are they good at and those kind of things. We want to analyze our learners, our people. So we've got analytics around the activities and experiences. We've got analytics around the people. And we can bring those together into something called learning program analytics. And this is where we define a learning program as, it's delivering a set of learning experiences to a set of learners with the hope of achieving an intended business objective. Learning program analytics seeks to say, did we achieve that objective? Was the learning effective at achieving a business objective? But to get there, this is where we need to build that foundation. We need to have a set of learning experience analytics and a set of learner analytics and understand those at a good level. And then we can start bringing them together with data about business outcomes to really get to that holy grail of learning analytics, which is demonstrating performance impact. So that's kind of the just quick primer on the learning analytics that are now possible with all of the data that we're getting out of xAPI. I want to share kind of a few examples with you of how people are putting this in practice in the real world. The first is an example of kind of the next generation learning ecosystem. This is where we're able to not just look at the LMS as the massive box of everything, and really take learning wherever we need it to be. learning happens everywhere, and let's just embrace that to provide the resources in the moment of need where the learners are to be able to give them the learning experience they need when they need it, whether that's via mobile or socially or informally. And while we're creating this next generation learning ecosystem, let's be sure to connect it with outcomes, be sure to connect it to the broader view within our organization or our context. So the first example comes from Visa, and they created Visa University, which includes all of the components that you see over here in their learning ecosystem. And let's start from the bottom left over there, where you see the user, where the user comes into Visa University, and they're using PathGather, which is a new type of tool, learning experience platform that brings together a lot of different content sources within the organization, but also from outside of the organization. And let's look up over there. They're syncing all that data, their user data from Workday, so it's all SSO, single sign-on to all these different tools. And you've got on the left there, Safari and Harvard Mentor Manager use kind of some traditional learning content tools. Then right there, you see, okay, there's the LMS, just one bubble amongst many for all of these different tools. And that's fine. The LMS is not going away. The LMS is always going to serve a valuable component for that formal training and that compliance training, pushing things out to learners and e-learning and those kind of things. But the point here is learning is so much broader than just that one single form of learning. And so let's embrace that in our entire ecosystem that we have here. The interesting bit starts to get when you look a little bit to the next two bubbles to the right there, SurveyMonkey, SharePoint. Those aren't learning tools. Those are just regular old consumer business tools, but they're incredibly valuable in this learning ecosystem. xAPI is allowing them to capture data from all of these tools, whether they're traditional learning tools or not, bring that all together, and this happens to be a Watershed customer here, into their learning record store and run unified analytics across all of these different tools. This is just one view into what the next generation learning ecosystem is starting to look like. Lots and lots more people doing interesting things like this and trying to embrace that really comprehensive look at where learning is going. So the next case study, next example, comes from a company called Applied Industrial Technology. If you haven't heard of Applied, they are the world's largest industrial distributor. They do about $3 billion in revenue. They've got hundreds of distribution centers where all of these dots are. They're kind of like the Amazon.com of industrial parts, although they don't like us saying that anymore because Amazon started distributing industrial parts. But big, massive company. And Applied recently rolled out a new SAP implementation to create kind of a new operational standard of work. And they had tons of data coming out of this new SAP system, but all their service center managers, the managers in each of these dots, didn't really know what to do with that. The service center manager was often a guy or gal who got promoted up from the warehouse. They weren't MBAs. They're more traditionally blue collar type folks, and so they needed to really improve their financial acumen to understand how to use all these reports and to optimize their operational efficiencies based on the data that they were getting. And so the organizational learning group at Applied developed a basic business finance course to kind of help people understand all these things. And they wanted to go do a lot of analytics and measure how did that work. They wanted to look at the learning versus their KPIs for learners that well beyond just the standard LMS reports they were getting and out of SAP. And they started doing all that stuff initially in Excel. Took a lot of work with VLOOKUPs and all of those kind of things. And so they decided to experiment with a learning record store and xAPI for collecting all this data. And they've had some really tremendous results over there. So one of the first things they were doing was they started by having a scatter plot that showed comprehension versus the application of the measured comprehension versus the application of the skills excuse me for just a minute. My headset is beeping at me, which means it's going to run out of batteries in a minute. I'm going to put a different one on. Hold for just 1 second here.
So this is John Alex, and while we switch headsets, I just wanted to say a few words here about the watershed. We work with watersheds in a project that we did with the American College of Chest Physicians, or CHEST, and we were able to take some data from medical mannequins and run them into an LRS and then into our learning management system, so faculty could to get real-time data analytics while they observed physicians intubating the mannequins. So Watershed worked with us to visualize that data and to provide usable metrics where the faculty and faculty physicians could review each of the students. And it was that whole idea of taking data and making it usable is a really important part of the story.
Okay, John, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I apologize for that. I thought I had plenty of battery, but I think my headphones are starting to get a little bit old. So moved on to the other set. Anyway, thanks for filling the space there. I appreciate that. So the first thing that Applied was doing was they're looking at, they measured the comprehension of a lot of the concepts versus their application of skills before they started the basic business finance course, and this enabled them to kind of anticipate high-low performers, and they used that to pair their people appropriately during the class time and the exercises. Then they started to go look at the collective impacts of training across the different KPIs. These charts are showing 3 different KPIs for past due collections, profit percentages, and chargebacks, and they're looking at that over time. As these are the actual KPIs from xAPI being fed into the learning record store to go look at how these things are actually increasing. And what they're able to show, looking at particularly the training on accounts receivable, is that the improvements in the service center standard of work practices and the learning that helped improve all those all contributed to collecting about $18 million in past due invoices, which went right down to the bottom line. So that was a huge impact they were able to show. They really enjoy looking at individual learners and visualizing their competencies and combining a bunch of different KPIs and assessment scores all into one place from a lot of different systems to compare each person against their benchmarks and understand their learning capacity, which allowed managers to really kind of go in and develop individual plans for each of these people. And one of my favorite stories is a lot of the unexpected things that people find when they start doing learning analytics. From Visa, there's just a great little story of they just happened to be looking at no-show rates for ILT, for classroom training, and they noticed that those no-show rates always spiked every Thursday. And they started scratching their head. Why was that? Well, some simple digging around indicated that they were always inviting a group that had a huge mission critical deadline on Friday to training on Thursday. So of course, when they got behind their deadline, they're going to skip their training. A simple scheduling shift, fixed that problem and increased the utilization of that class and made everybody better able to attend it. But it's just, that's not a complicated thing. It's a super, super simple thing that they never would have noticed if they hadn't been just visualizing this data and using it routinely to notice the abnormality. But it became just, a huge win for them. So when we're doing learning analytics, we don't need to have big, complicated things to get big wins out there. It's really the key is just starting and using it routinely. One of the wins from Applied over here, looking at a graph like this, they noticed somebody who quite obviously did not understand what he was doing in one of these skills, but his performance, his KPI was super, and that doesn't make any sense. And so they started digging into it, and they found out that that employee had a manager who was just doing the work for him. And so that was an opportunity to go have a coaching moment and say, hey, why don't we just teach this person and develop their skills instead of having you doing double work. It's another thing, you never would have noticed that, you never would have found that problem unless you were actually sitting in there and looking at the data. So they're doing another correlation on whether there's a correlation between application versus comprehension, and within the for each of the KPIs that they're going to look at to make sure that there is those assessments are valid and everything. Next case study, kind of one of my favorite ones, and pretty similar to the one that John was alluding to when I had to switch my headphones over there. I didn't get to hear the whole thing, but it was a great one that they did. This one comes from, it was a similar one. It comes from a hospital chain called MedStar, who was below benchmark on what's called code blue response rate. For those of you who aren't in the medical field, code blue is when your heart stops. It's when your face is turning blue because there's no oxygen. And the things that matter in a code blue response are how quickly can you clear chest, how quickly can you start defibrillating, how quickly can you get drugs into them. And this isn't the type of training that can happen just in one place. So MedStar put together kind of a multi-pronged training program over there. They have their LMS, and then they have, from there, they did kind of a mobile simulation to allow people to practice this stuff on the floor. And then they, did actual observations of in-person, mock code blue, calls out there to go look at things. And they brought data from all of these different places, from traditional learning to mobile to real-world simulation, all into one place. So they could go and look at where were people getting stuck, where were the code blue response times increasing the most, and can we improve the learning to then go address those challenges and look to see did that improve the performance in the mobile device, and then can we improve the mobile device to go see if that improved the performance in the mock simulations, and ultimately does that change the overall data from the electronic record system. And it's been in this kind of amazing feedback loop. One of their quick early insights was when people came into the room, it took them a few seconds to identify a leader, to figure out who was in charge. They all just kind of stood, everybody knew what to do, but they're all just looking around at each other trying to go say, hey, who's going to do what? So it was a simple thing to just go back and change the training to go identify the importance of picking a leader and how that should happen. And again, that just one little insight is driving big change, and taking a few seconds off of that response rate, which at the end of the day, I'm hopeful that Watershed will be this huge successful company, and we'll all be on private jets and islands and all that kind of great stuff. But if we just stop here and we've improved MedStar's code blue response rate by a few seconds, we may have saved a life or two, and that's kind of fun. That's exciting for me, and it makes it really, really fun to see this work that we're doing. And I think, well, we might not be able to save lives. Some of us can probably maybe save lives with our work, but the work that we're doing can be hugely impactful to the rest of our organization. And I really do believe that using data and being able to get at that data with xAPI is going to provide a huge boost for all of us and allow us to do some really, really impactful things in the coming years. So I'd love to encourage you to kind of get started with a lot of these things. We can send some resources and that make it easy to get started playing around. Watershed's now offering a free essentials product that allows people who want to start tinkering to get started without any cost. And there's a lot of tools out there that all work with xAPI. So, but getting started with learning ALX is pretty simple. You guys have to start gathering your data, start measuring, start bringing it together, get to know it, figure out what's there, what's missing, what's reliable, what's not reliable. The big one often comes in kind of operationalizing that, finding a way to get somebody out of Excel hell, or just finding some interesting metrics and KPIs to start looking at in your daily, your weekly, your monthly meetings, looking for trends and just trying to get a feel for that pulse. From there, you kind of delve into the deeper, trying to understand why, trying to ask questions of your data, which will often lead you into creating experiments to go say, hey, let's go, I have a theory, if we do this differently, this result will happen, and you can start setting up some A/B tests to validate a hypothesis or so. But really the exciting part is when you get to show off your data, when you get to show that to the rest of the organization. It's amazing the reaction that the rest of the organization will get when you start showing them good data about learning. One of my favorite quote was again from Applied when Andy showed off some of the stuff they had done to their operations department. His manager said, this is the type of stuff we crawl through cut glass to get to over here. It really is truly impactful and truly changes learning's position to be able to go in and demonstrate what they're doing and show actual data to use it. So try to wrap up a few minutes early. I don't know if we have any questions come through or not, if we have a talkative bunch or not, but happy to answer some if there are any. But I'm also happy to talk about this stuff anytime. The business card there says my title is founder and CEO, but my real job, they joke around here, is to be the company mascot, going around and talking about all of this stuff and getting people excited about and hearing about people's challenges and what they're doing and how they see these things being applied. So I'm easy to reach. Feel free to reach out, LinkedIn, Twitter, email, phone, whatever you like. And I'd love to carry on the conversation with anybody who's interested.
Hey, Mike.
So, Mike,
we did have one question. You can go ahead first, John.
Well, yeah, I noticed that the Department of Defense has done some endorsement of the xAPI standard, and many have said this is a tipping point.
Yeah.
Can you explain your thoughts on that, and maybe also add why, whether or not you feel it's been slow to take on or it's taken on about how you thought as far as the usage of xAPI and LRS?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, several things there. I'm trying to find that timeline slide. Here we go. So here on the timeline of SCORM, you see something right here in about 2005, 2006, DODI 1322.26. DODI is the Department of Defense instruction. It's policy for the entire Department of Defense. And in 2005, they updated their policy on the procurement of learning systems to say anything we procure must implement SCORM. And that was, a huge catalyst for SCORM, because the DoD is one of the, if not the largest consumer of online learning systems in the world. So all the vendors who wanted to bid on those contracts had to implement SCORM, and then SCORM was in all of these systems, and so it just kind of became the de facto industry standard. You'll see that happened about 5 years after SCORM 1.0 was originally released, and that was really what led to the explosion in SCORM around that time. Over here on the right-hand side of the timeline, you see updated DODI 1322.26. Just this year in 2017, they updated the instruction to say, thou shalt now use Experience API in your procurements. That just went out, just became policy a couple months ago. You'll notice it's about 5 years and four or 5 years since the introduction of xAPI, so kind of a similar timing on that. It is yet to be seen whether that will provide the same catalyzing effect that SCORM did or not, but there's a lot of optimism that it will. It certainly doesn't hurt anything. The second part of your question on the adoption of xAPI and how quickly or slowly I thought it would happen or is happening, it is certainly happening at a very good pace. I will admit to being one of the most naive people in the world, because in 2012 I thought we had this brilliant idea, and of course by the end of 2013 everybody would have already implemented it, and of course it would be taking off. But people just don't do exactly what you tell them to do, unfortunately, and especially when you're talking about enterprise technology that changes. It just takes a long time, and the adoption of a standard is kind of a chicken and egg cycle. You need to have the more people that adopt it, the more valuable it becomes. And so for one vendor to adopt it, and then another vendor to adopt it, then the next round says, oh, that's a good idea, but they've got a 6-month development schedule. So these chicken egg cycles take a little while to get through. The adoption of xAPI is particularly interesting in that there's a few hundred vendors that have adopted it. You can see that on experienceapi.com. They have an adopters section down there. There's hundreds of logos down there. But largely they're amongst the smaller, more innovative companies that are out there that don't have a lot of market share just yet. xAPI is an interesting proposition for the larger established vendors, because they've built their business model on this 17-year-old model. They're very successful on this model from the year 2000, and they've made their systems bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to accommodate all of these new tools that have come into place and since then. So in some sense, xAPI could be very disruptive to their business model, and it's certainly not consistent with their business model, which is everything happens in my system. xAPI says, no, everything happens everywhere. Your system is just one of many. So the adoption amongst the larger vendors has very much been at the do the bare minimum to check the box level. So that when you're talking about adoption of xAPI, there's lots of tools out there, but before they have it'll be a little bit longer before they have a dominant market share because the industry has been so stagnant for so long.
Great, thank you, Mike. So because we're reaching the half hour here, we'll have any other questions answered after the webinar, but we want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please take a short post-webinar survey. This will help us improve the quality of our webinars. And we will also be sending a follow-up email with the link to the webinar recording. And if you'd like to watch this again and share it with your networks. Thank you again, Mike. That was great.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.